Welcoming back Ed Lazear. So he reminded me that he's been here 20 years ago as part of a visiting committee to the center. So I'm very happy to have him back. Let me just say a few. Department of Economics. But he said he'd also visited the center. So the committee was also for the center. So I think it was for both. Ed Lazear, for the non-economists who don't know him, he's a labor economist. He started his career at the University of Chicago. He's been there for, I think, 18 years, and then made the rational decision moving to Stanford. Much better skiing in California than Illinois. I think there is a Chinese curse saying that may you live in interesting times. There is a less known Chinese curse that may you come to the attention to those of authority, and I think both apply to Ed, who became the chief economic advisor to George W. Bush and chose a period between 2006 and 2009. So those were interesting times, and I think that's pretty much what Ed is going to talk about. So.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I really do enjoy coming back again, seeing so many old friends, former students, one of whom is now currently in the position that I held in the Israeli government. It really is a pleasure not only to be back, but also to see the center thriving. And I do want to say one thing about that. I really applaud the fact that a center like this exists, particularly now. When you look at economics and what's happened in economics and some of the trends in economics, I think are not necessarily helpful. And a center like the Center on Rationality, which really does very serious, hard-nosed economics and pushes economics to the limit to try to explain what's going on in the world, to me seems like exactly the right thing to be doing. And so I think it's to its credit that it has been so successful and been such an important institution, not only in Israel, but has been influential throughout the rest of the world, certainly in the United States, as Ehud pointed out, so many students and so many great scholars. So congratulations to the center, and happy birthday. Eyal asked me to give a talk, which really it's a little early in the conference to do this. You know, we really had only one serious talk, and I kind of think of this as almost comic relief. In fact, if you look at the title, you know, Rationality in Policymaking, it's almost an oxymoron. You know, can there be such a thing as a rational policymaker? But I was asked to do this rather than, I guess he didn't trust me. He figured after spending 3 years in government, I couldn't write a serious economics paper anymore. So he figured I should work on this. So I've decided to comply. And what I plan to do in the next half hour or so is talk to you about how what I think of as a rational model actually does prevail in the way people think about public policy. I'll go through some examples, set up a little bit of a model, a little bit of a formal structure to at least think about this, and talk to you more specifically about decision-making under uncertainty and how that relates to the delegation of authority in normal circumstances, and then in particular in crisis circumstances, which as Ilan alluded to, was one that prevailed at least during the time I was there, the second half of the period during which I was there. So let me do that. All right. Well, what's the structure? What I want to do again is I'll start by talking about the standard model of decision making under uncertainty, and then extend it to the delegation of power. I want to lead you through a couple of examples, some of which have become urban legend and which I think are only in part accurate. Talk to you about how a rational policymaker would actually think about some of these things. You see this kind of funny dominoes and popcorn, and let me leave that to later. But I'll talk about the Bear Stearns bailout, why that happened, how that led up to September of 2008, which people refer to as the Lehman period, and then talk to you a little bit about the automakers bailout, and try to do this in the context of a rational model. Then finally, I'll I'll try to give you some examples of rationality, not necessarily meaning that you make correct decisions. A rational decision doesn't have to be correct. Obviously, it can be ex ante rational and ex post incorrect. And I'll relate that to a couple of examples that I think pertain to the real world, both when I was there and also currently going on in the United States. I am going to, because I'm an economist, I believe in comparative advantage, and my comparative advantage is definitely the United States. So I will stick to that rather than trying to become an expert on Israel, given that I just landed last night. I think that would be a bit presumptuous. So that's where I'm going. All right, so what's the basic model for decision making under uncertainty? Now, I titled this slide "Ice Cream Cones and Mud Pies," and let me tell you why I called it that. Whenever we would make tough decisions, and you know, you're used to this when government people make tough decisions, and they have to go on TV and explain these tough decisions. And I remember doing that one time, and it happened to be associated with the auto bailout. And you know, we had just given these big loans to the automakers, and I was on, I believe it was, I don't know, CNN or one of them, and the reporter said something like, "Well, you know, aren't you worried about moral hazard?" And the answer was, "Well, yeah, of course we're worried about moral hazard. That's why we don't want to do it. You know, that's why we didn't like having to make this decision." But the problem was we had two bad choices, and the way one of my colleagues put it is he said, "You know, people don't understand that the easy choices, those are the ones you don't hear about. So it's not like we're choosing between an ice cream cone and a mud pie. We're choosing between two mud pies, and the question is, which one of the mud pies do you want to eat?" So that's the situation that you're always in, and that's what this picture is supposed to be about. So obviously, this is a situation where when you're making a decision under uncertainty, you have two kinds of errors that you can make. Obviously, the false positive and false negative. I always use those rather than type 1 and type 2 because I always forget which is which. So the false positive and false negative error. And what I have on this picture is conditional probabilities of making a false positive error, given that that's the wrong thing to do, and the conditional probability of making a false negative error, given that taking the action was the right thing to do. And these things are anchored at 1 because you can think of the two extremes as you accept everything that comes along. Well, then you know you're certain to make a false positive error conditional on having the action being the wrong thing to do. Or you could go to the other extreme shown by point C, where you reject everything, and then you know with certainty that you're going to make a false negative error. And then there's simply an opportunity set that you see where you can choose to be at any point along that, and the question is, where do you choose to be? Maybe some point like A. Now, obviously, we would prefer to have a curve like the one that B is on, the dotted line, but that requires more information, and that requires more time and more investment in resources that are costly. And so this is the trade-off. At some point, you decide, all right, this is the trade-off that we're going to end up with, and that's what I'm trying to show here. Now, what I want to do again is extend this not so much to the simple issue of decision making under uncertainty, but rather think about some authority structures and talk about how that relates to different situations in government. So the way I want you to think about it is that I'm gonna have three kinds of structures here. I'm going to call them hierarchies, meetings, and a flat structure. And a hierarchical structure you can think of as one individual makes a decision. If his decision is yes, then he passes it on to his supervisor, and then the supervisor can either accept or veto. And so it's one individual passing on to one individual. It takes two yeses then to get the project accepted. At the other extreme, you can think of a flat structure where a project comes along, an individual looks at the project, evaluates it, accepts or rejects. That's the end of the story. So that's like how we operate in research. We don't go to the dean and say, you think this is a good thing for us to work on. You just decide whether you're going to work on it or not. And if it turns out to be good, you get rewarded for it. If it turns out to be bad, you still get rewarded for it. So, but that's the way our field tends to work. And then in the middle is something that I would call meetings, or sometimes I call it a second opinion, where you have at least two people who evaluate a project, and then there's some decision rule, some weighting rule that takes the information from each of those two decision makers, comes out with some decision. And that's the typical structure that I'm going to say, argue prevails in most government structures, where you have meetings, people get together, there's someone like the president who listens to this, listens to all of his advisors, and then chooses how to weight those pieces of advice and then makes a decision based on that. So that's the standard kind of structure. All right, so the model, there is, by the way, a formal paper that's actually in an appendix of a book I wrote a few years back that discusses this and does these proofs in a more formal way, but let me just walk you through them quickly. So the idea here is that hierarchies tend to accept fewer projects than a flat structure, and the easiest way to think about this is think of a world where there are 2 N reviewers and each reviews 1 project per period. Then assume that absent any other information, an individual will accept with probability P at the first stage of the hierarchy. A flat structure has 2 N reviews and accepts 2 PN of the projects given that structure, because you're going to accept any with probability P. And then let this P sub YY be the conditional probability of an acceptance by a supervisor in a hierarchical structure, given that a subordinate has already accepted. Well then, a hierarchy, which now takes 2 reviews, approves P times N times PYY, again, because you have to go through 2 stages, which is smaller than the flat structure, which is 2PN, again, because PYY is less than 2. So this is a pretty trivial result that you're going to see more acceptances in a flat structure than a hierarchical structure.
That assumes that for written acceptance is the same in the structure.
No, no.
I may accept which I may accept the higher probability than P. There may be Gaussian adjustment for probability.
Okay, that's what I was trying to pick up with PYY, but you're saying even at the first stage, I could alter that. That's true. That's true. Okay, so let me try to show you that the meeting structure is in the middle of those two, because what's going to happen is then this is not obvious. This one is less than obvious, and I'll show you why. The meetings, which is what I really want to focus on, is that you're going to use some weighting of 2 views. So in the first case, what you get is 1 person reviews. In this case, you get 2 people review, and then you're going to use those 2 views and you're going to combine them in some particular way. Now, the question is, which way does this go relative to flat? Is it a more stringent structure or is it a less stringent structure? And the reason that I say that it's not so obvious is that you might think it's more stringent because you have 2 reviews now, but in addition to declining those that were already accepted, what you could do is you could reverse those that were already declined. So it's not quite as obvious as it seems. It turns out that meetings are more stringent than a flat structure, and that's primarily because it takes 2 reviews rather than 1. So if you think about what's going on, in a flat structure, you can review twice as many projects as you would review in a meeting structure. And what that means is that the other half that aren't reviewed are just by definition rejected because they don't even get reviewed in the first place. It just takes more time to go through this. And the time component is going to be key, and that's what I want to emphasize in the context of the crisis structure, crisis environment versus the normal environment. So if I just array these along that picture that I showed you earlier, what you're going to tend to get is something that looks like this. And again, the ones that I want to focus on are really the bottom 2. The hierarchy is not so important in this context. I want to focus primarily on the meetings version versus the flat. Okay. So here's the question. The question is, which way do you go? And so what I want to do is set up a simple decision rule in 2 different environments. One I'm calling the normal environment, which is something where we have, people talked about the great moderation. All the macroeconomists thought they had everything nailed. We were never going to have a big recession again because we were all so smart, figured it all out. So that's the normal environment. And then, unfortunately, the one in which I happened to live was the crisis environment, where it turned out that maybe things were not quite as good as we thought. Maybe we weren't quite as smart. So let's think of the normal environment and the payoffs that I have here. Again, I just took an example. Assume there's a 0.5 probability of a recession and a 0.5 probability of no recession. If there's a recession in the normal environment, if you take an action, the gain to that is 20. If there's no recession, the gain to that is minus 100, because you're doing things that you really shouldn't be doing. And you can think about that as distortion, economic distortion, budget consequences, those sorts of things associated with actions that are inappropriate at the government level under normal circumstances when everything is fine. All right, now in the crisis environment, everything's the same except that I've just altered the payoff to taking an action during a recessionary time. So this says that if things are really, really bad and we're in a crisis environment, maybe it does pay to do something, and under those circumstances, the net gain is 200. All right, well, given this payoff structure, under the normal environment, I call that don't fix what ain't broke. This is essentially, you know, most of the time, leave the government out of it. You don't want to do things because we're going to mess things up. And so that shows, you know, the expected gain would be minus 40 if you took an action. So the idea there would be ex ante, what you would prefer to do is not take an action, don't fix what ain't broke. If you knew that you were in a crisis environment, then the cliche that fits is he who hesitates is lost, okay? Rather than don't fix it ain't broke, it's that if you don't fix it, you know, you could end up in this terrible downward spiral, and that's what we're concerned about doing. So in the first case, you fail to take an action, and because you decline the action, the kind of error that you introduce there is a false negative error if the recession occurs. In the crisis environment, you have exactly the reverse, which is that you take an action, and then if it turns out that there wasn't a recession, then you get a false positive error. And many of my colleagues at the Hoover Institution back at Stanford believe that we committed a very serious false positive error, because if we had only left things alone, then everything would have been fine. Okay. Now, of course, it's tough to know because we don't see the counterfactual, but people do allege that, and so that's certainly one possibility. All right. Now the question is, the question is, which do you do? And the argument here would be, well, if you're in a crisis environment and what you're worried about is making the false negative error, that is not taking the action and ending up with a downward spiral, then in this picture, there it is. In this picture, what you want to do is you want to move in the direction of flat and say, all right, we're willing to tolerate the false positive error in that situation. We really want to avoid the false negative error. And so you tend to move in the direction of a flat structure from what I called the meetings structure. All right, so how do I see that? Well, think about this in the context of the military. You know, one way to think about this is that you give, when you're in the middle of a battle, when you're in the war, you give the generals a tremendous amount of authority to take action on the spot. You don't have to go back to central command or to the commander-in-chief and ask, you know, should you mobilize this particular set of troops over here to do this sort of thing? Because what you're worried about is failure to take action could lose the day. The whole town could be overrun, and of course the cost of that is that there are negative diplomatic consequences from taking such actions when they weren't warranted, but you're usually willing to do that. Coming back to home in the context that I know better, which is the economic crisis, we viewed failures to respond again as possibly causing a huge downward spiral, and the false positive was that you wasted money, you create moral hazard. All of those were certainly problems that we were well aware of, and there was a lot of debate. Every time that a policy would come up, we would worry about that. Now, the argument that I made in terms of delegation of authority was that during the crisis period, what you tended to see, not only in the context of battles where generals are given more authority, but also in the context of this economic battle, the agencies were given more authority as well. So Treasury, essentially, you know, the equivalent of the finance ministry, Treasury, was given a tremendous amount of authority to implement on its own. And it wasn't even a conscious decision, it was almost a de facto decision, because Treasury controls the resources. So a guy like me, or a guy like Gene right now, you know, our power, we have no budget, we have no money, we can't do anything other than simply influence the president through the power of our arguments. Treasury's actually got the budget. They control the money, and they're the ones that are actually going to go out and spend the money. And so unless you're going to have them report back at every given stage, what you're going to see during these crisis periods is that you're going to move from a meeting structure to a flat structure. So here's a picture of a meeting, okay? This is literally a meeting. I thought I'd put this up again for entertainment. But you might recognize a couple of the people here. Let's see. Actually, most of them, all right, you probably, this guy, you know this guy. This was the president. That's the vice president. This is Hank Paulson. That's Ben Bernanke, myself, Joshua Bolton, Joel Kaplan. Most of those guys in this room, by the way, could have also served the Israeli government as well, as you can probably tell by their last names. So this was kind of the beginning. This was the meeting structure, and we would argue out, you know, exactly what we should be doing. But in the end, the authority was given to Treasury to implement the policies that we talked about in these meetings. And once the implementation phase began, there was pretty much no stopping these guys. So let me give you an example of that. Let me put it in the context of the TARP. I think most of you probably know that word, TARP. It was the word that was used in the United States. It stood for Toxic Asset Relief Program. And the idea initially was to buy up toxic assets. And if some of you followed, you know, I'm sure everybody was following this stuff at that time. Even in Israel, you were probably pretty concerned about what was happening in the United States, because we were such a big part of the economy. This was a situation that was a really tough one, because it really violated the basic principles of this Republican administration, which was that you don't want to have, you know, this huge intervention where you're going in and intervening, you know, taking over, essentially taking over these firms in some sense. That was a really bad idea. So why did we do it? Well, this meeting that you see up here, the beginning of the meeting, the guy in the middle with the white beard, Ben Bernanke, started out by saying, Mr. President, we're on the verge of total financial collapse. Okay, this was September 15th. It was the afternoon that Lehman failed. So it's pretty scary. You know, when your Fed chairman tells you, you know, you're on the verge of total financial collapse, that's not a good way to start a meeting. And in fact, you know, and then he turns to me and he said, well, you know, Eddie, what do you think? And I said, yeah, it looks pretty bad. You know, I kind of think that too. And I'll put that back in context in a moment, because I think the Lehman thing is actually a minor part of that. I have probably a different view than most of the world does on this, but let me try to argue that for you. Anyway, that's what happened. So again, what happened was, at that point, we went to Congress. We didn't have the authority. At that point, we had no money. We had no authority to actually go out and bail out any of these institutions or purchase up these toxic assets. Got the authority from Congress to do that, and that was a bit controversial. I'm happy to chat about that as much as you want in the discussion after. But we got the authority to do it, and then it was essentially turned over to Treasury, because the authority was given, the money is given to Treasury, and they get to implement it. Now, there was a disagreement on that I'll come to in a minute, but there was a disagreement about what we should actually be doing. The question was, should you go out and should you buy up the toxic assets, or should you instead simply capitalize the financial institutions and try to make them strong enough to withstand the shock? And those are very different views of the world, and they're based on different models of how you think crises work. And again, I'll come back to that in the context of popcorn and dominoes in a minute. But there were differences, and you know, without saying who was on which side, let me just tell you that some of us believed that buying up toxic assets was not going to work. I can certainly tell you that I was on that side. I'll tell you my own position, and that was based on some work that my group had done. So the Council of Economic Advisors, which is sort of the internal technical group in the administration, had studied this, and we determined that there were about $3 trillion of toxic assets out there at the time. Well, the TARP, the first tranche of the TARP, was going to be about $350 billion. That's a lot of money, $350 billion. But even $350 billion, if you had succeeded in spending it overnight to buy up the toxic assets, you would still buy up only about 10% of what we thought was the total amount out there at the time. And so we just didn't feel that that was going to be sufficient to solve the problem, or really even to make a dent in the problem. And so what we felt would be a more effective strategy was to make the patient strong enough to survive the disease. And that meant capitalizing the financial sector. There were precedents, by the way, for this. This is what Sweden had done back in the early 90s when they had their financial crisis. We looked at some of the other places had done this. We looked at what Japan had done, the stuff that didn't work, the stuff that seemed to work a little bit in Japan, Korea, and so forth. And so, so our view is that. But we did not carry the day. Initially, what happened was the president went out, gave a big speech, said we're going to buy up toxic assets. 3 weeks later, it turned out that, that they had to shift away from that, and this was essentially a problem of implementation rather than a problem of design. It wasn't so much that, you know, Hank Paulson at Treasury said, okay, I think Eddie's right, you know, we're going to do what he said. What they found was that they simply were unable to go out and buy up the toxic assets for two reasons. One is they couldn't do it quickly. It's not easy to put together a plan to price these things and figure out how to get those things into the government's hand and to do this stuff, you know, in a couple-week period. And then the second thing was they also found out, and this is kind of a corollary of that, they couldn't get people to sell. Why not? Well, there was a rule called mark-to-market. I don't know if you've heard of that, if they use that term in Israel. Mark-to-market is an accounting strategy, convention. And what that says is you can carry things on your books at a certain value until there's actually a market price for that. And once there's a market price, then you have to mark everything to what that market price is, either up or down. Well, in this case, they were carrying, the banks, the financial institutions were carrying things on their books at 100 cents on the dollar that they knew once they put out for sale, even to the government at an inflated price, was going to be at something well below that, and that was going to cause their asset position to fall. So big problem, so they couldn't get that. So, you know, 3 weeks later, Hank goes on TV, he says, yeah, well, you know, we're doing it this other way, and, you know, I made a mistake. It was a little embarrassing for all of us. I mean, this was sort of the, I would say, not the finest hour of the administration, but it's just like, you know, in battles, you know, sometimes you lose some tanks and even some soldiers, and that's what happened in this one. So there was some casualties along the way, and that was certainly one of them. All right. So let me turn to a different example now that was also an interesting case. This was one that I dealt with sort of firsthand. And this was the issue of the auto companies, the auto bailouts. So this is essentially a game of chicken. But let me tell you the story of how we got to this game of chicken. What happened was in late October, this was October of 2008, the CEO of GM came to the administration and said, we are going to declare bankruptcy on the day before the election if you don't bail us out. Literally. This was not subtle. Just said that's what's going to happen. And the reason was they were running out of money. They didn't have any choice. They were running out of money. They said they couldn't make their payments. So we called their bluff. This was this sort of mini game of chicken. We called their bluff and said, tough, we're not bailing you out. Go ahead. Well, they didn't do it. We had looked at their books. We figured they could survive. They didn't do it. They didn't declare bankruptcy. But by mid-December, it became clear that, that there was no way for them to make another payment. What happened was, again, technical sort of detail, but every 4th of the month, their payment came due. They had about a $5 billion payment to their suppliers. We knew how much money they had. They weren't going to make it. January 4th, they were going to be out of business, and they weren't going to make it. So this was a game of chicken, and it was a game of chicken that the government lost because the government could not pre-commit. So here was the situation. What we would have liked them to do was to prepare for an orderly bankruptcy, to have spent time in advance figuring out how to get debtor in possession financing and so forth, prepare for an orderly prepackaged bankruptcy. That would have been the best thing for the government. And had they done that, the government would have been able to do essentially nothing. Not quite. We probably would have had to give them a little bit of support, but let's assume we would have done nothing. On the other hand, what they didn't want to do that. What they wanted was they wanted to do nothing. In fact, they were explicit in saying, we are not going to prepare for bankruptcy. Bankruptcy is not an option. They made that explicit. They said, we're not doing it, we're not preparing, and you guys either have to bail us out or tough, we're going under. So the problem was that the government has a tough time committing to no bailouts. You can always commit to that ex ante, but it's not usually a credible commitment, and even for a Republican administration, which doesn't like bailouts, as you saw ex post, the auto companies won. So they won that game. They won that game of chicken, and the reason they won it is that when we looked at it and analyzed it, we being my group, the Council of Economic Advisors, we did the technical analysis, and we estimated that we would lose, this was December of 2008, we would lose immediately 1.1 million jobs directly, right then, because the companies did not have, we knew there was nobody out there that was going to finance these guys. So without any government financing, it wasn't a question of Chapter 11, it was a question of complete liquidation of those companies. The companies would go under that month. Their dealerships would also go under that month. That alone accounted for 1.1 million jobs. So that was a lot of jobs. It's a lot of personal hardship, obviously, for the individuals who lose those jobs. In addition to that, we were also right in what we thought was the midst of the financial crisis. It was actually already starting to ease, but we didn't know that at the time. So we just felt again that this was the kind of problem that we couldn't put up with at that point, and so we couldn't bear the false negative error of not doing that. Now later on, what ended up happening was the Obama team came in. We put on conditions on the loan. Again, we knew that President Obama was going to come in. He probably wouldn't do the same things as we did. What ended up happening was when President Obama actually did force the actual bankruptcy and restructuring, they gave a lot more of the company to the United Auto Workers than I think most anticipated that would have happened. But in some sense, I don't want to say it's just a detail. It's an important detail. But we knew at the time that we did the bailout that something like this was going to happen. All right. So I said at the beginning that just because a policy is rational, and I think these policies were rational at the time, that doesn't necessarily mean that they were always correct. And Bear Stearns, I think, is the best example, because Bear Stearns was bailed out in March of 2008, and yet the financial crisis still happened. Okay, so that bailout didn't stop the financial crisis. Now, why is that? Well, I think of that as having two different models of what causes crises, and I refer to these as dominoes and popcorn. The dominoes model is, everybody knows what the domino theory is. That's pure contagion. So one domino falls, then the next domino falls. And that's the world we thought we were in March of 2008. We thought we were in a dominoes world where everything was contagion. And that meant that if we could only keep Bear Stearns standing, then the next domino wouldn't fall, and the next domino, and so forth. Okay, so we were primarily focused on preventing contagion in March of 2008. There's another theory which I call the popcorn theory, and the popcorn theory says, well, it's not contagion. Think about making popcorn, and again, This is for the old guys who make popcorn in the ways that we used to do it, not in the microwave. Okay, so this is, you take a pan, you put some oil in the pan, you throw the kernels in the pan, and then they get hot and they start to pop. Okay, and you put a pot lid on it so that they don't go all over the room. All right, now think about what would happen in popcorn if before the first kernel popped, you pulled it out of the pan. Okay, well that kernel wouldn't pop, but the others are still going to pop because the oil is hot. The kernels are there. All the conditions are still right for those things to continue to pop. And I think that's what was going on in the financial crisis. We were actually in a popcorn world, not a dominoes world. It doesn't mean that contagion wasn't an issue, but for the most part, what was going on was the problems were so pervasive and they were so so structured throughout the entire system that there was no way that preventing any one domino from falling was going to solve the problem. I'll come back to that in a minute because I want to talk about Lehman. I think the same kind of problem, not dominoes and popcorn so much, but the same kind of being rational does not imply that you're correct, pertains to the stimulus, the Obama stimulus. So we're not the only guys that made mistakes. I think that the Obama team made their fair share as well. And I would argue that the stimulus is one example of that. So back in 2009, when the Obama team came in, they instituted about $1 trillion worth of stimulus money over the next 3 years. Did it work? Well, this graph shows you what the effect of the stimulus was, taking the highest estimates of the effect of the stimulus. So people disagree on the effect of the stimulus. Al is here. Al's from Harvard. Your colleague Robert Barrow thinks the effect is 0. A couple of my colleagues at Hoover, John Taylor and John Kogan, think the effect is 0. But if you listen to the Council of Economic Advisors, the Obama team, economics team, or a couple of others, you'll get numbers that are more in the range of 3 percentage points. So what that tells you is that the recession would have been 3 percentage points worse but for the stimulus, okay? So the actual recession in the United States was about an 11% recession. That means that if you look at where GDP is today, it would have been, if we stayed on the same trajectory, it would have been 11% higher than it is right now where we are today. If you take the upper bound of the estimate, that tells you that the recession would have been a 14% recession instead of an 11% recession, but for the stimulus. Again, using the upper estimates, the highest estimates, the government estimates. What was the Great Depression? Well, the Great Depression over the same period of time was a 38% recession, okay? So this gives you some perspective. It says, all right, obviously a 14% recession is worse than an 11% recession, no doubt. So if you believe the high estimates, you got some good out of it. But it wasn't like this prevented the Great Depression. Even by the highest estimates, we weren't even close to having the Great Depression under this scenario. What was the cost? Well, the cost, of course, is this very large increase in the size of the government, which I'll show you in a minute. Before doing that, let me show you one other picture that I think is kind of interesting. My colleague and friend Larry Summers, who has essentially replaced me, he had a different title, but it replaced me as the chief economist in the Obama administration, was instrumental in pushing through cash for clunkers. Did anybody over here hear about cash for clunkers? Did you guys hear about that? This was a program that was designed to accelerate purchases of autos. And it sure did, but any economist would know that most of what you're going to get is intertemporal substitution rather than changes in the long-term behavior. I mean, it's pretty obvious. We know that, for example, if you study labor supply, we know that intertemporal elasticities of labor supply are much higher than long-run elasticities of labor supply. Intertemporal elasticities of anything are much higher than long-run elasticities. And those guys surely knew that as well. But I think it was ex-ante rational for them to do that, again, because they needed to do something, and this looked like another way to get money into the economy. Now, the reason I say it's, you can kind of see it here. So here's what happened. This is when cash for clunkers came in. You get this huge increase in sales. And then in the subsequent months, you get a decrease in sales. that almost exactly, almost to the car, offsets what you got during that period. So, you know, so you get this intertemporal substitution, but it doesn't really do much in terms of changing the nature of the economy. All right. Well, there are also policies that fail not because they're irrational or wrong, but because it's much tougher. It turns out, again, this is an imperfect information issue, it turns out that it's much tougher to implement these policies than you think it would have been. Let me give you the example of Lehman. So I was around there at Lehman time. I know pretty much what happened. You know, people said, well, you know, they let Lehman go. In fact, that wasn't true. There was an attempt to save Lehman that actually failed. So it wasn't a decision to let Lehman go. In fact, the decision was to save Lehman. What happened was the decision to save Lehman was a failure not at the decision stage, but at the implementation stage. We had a weekend, essentially, to put together that deal. And during that period, on Sunday afternoon, the potential buyer of Lehman was Barclays, and Barclays pulled out. Their government said they couldn't do it. And at that point, it was simply too late to do anything else. The Fed viewed themselves as not having the authority to do it. I can explain the details. It's subtle as to why they could do Bear Stearns and not Lehman. But they felt that Bear Stearns was legal, Lehman was not. Treasury at that point didn't have any money. They didn't have the TARP, so they couldn't do it. So that was a policy that failed not because of design, but rather because of a failure of implementation. Now, as I said, this is more of an aside, but I think Lehman, people always talk about Lehman, you know, and they even refer to the Lehman moment. I think Lehman was a relatively trivial part of the crisis, and here's why. Again, it goes back to popcorn and dominoes. I think popcorn is what was going on, not dominoes. So if I look at the history of what was going on up to that point, let me just refresh your memories on this. I remember it vividly because I happened to be there. But what happened was the recession had started 10 months earlier. We didn't know it, but the recession, as NBER dated, it started back in December of 2007. So we're already 10 months into a recession. Bear Stearns had already failed and had been saved, of course, but it had failed. A bunch of markets locked up. The auction rate securities market failed. No one knew this. The student loan market actually failed. We came in and figured out a way to save that. People actually didn't know that had happened. Fannie and Freddie failed the week before Lehman. The market had already fallen 3,000 points the weekend before Lehman. AIG was essentially gone. We knew that weekend. Whether Lehman had survived or not was irrelevant. AIG was gone. Washington Mutual and Wachovia, two big banks, were close to gone as well. And the auto failures, which actually happened after, had almost nothing to do with Lehman. There were some things that Lehman did exacerbate, so there's no doubt that there was some contagion. The one example, probably the most important example, was the lockup of the money market, which happened right after Lehman. A particular money market fund did what they called break the buck, and there was a run on money markets by institutional investors, and that, to me, I would view that as clearly having been a Lehman result, but that was exacerbated by Lehman. But again, I would argue that Lehman was more a result of the crisis than a cause of it. Another example of policies that fail for reason of implementation, the stimulus. Again, just a piece of folklore. Back in December, after President Obama had already been elected, we knew that, you know, I knew Larry was coming in, a bunch of these guys were going to do the stimulus. We had a meeting, called my team in mid-December, and I said, you know, should we propose a stimulus? What are we waiting for? We already know, you know, we're in a recession, we got the financial crisis, these guys are going to do it 2 months from now. Why don't we do it? And the answer was, we went through the scenario, essentially proposed pretty much what they ended up doing, and figured that we couldn't get the money into the economy quickly enough. Well, if you look at the data, that's exactly what happened. It's very difficult to get the money spent. So an example is if you give $1 to the Department of Transportation, you'll get about 25 cents of that spent during the first year, and the rest will trickle out, it turns out, over the next 11 years or so. So it's very difficult to get money into the economy no matter how hard you try. The easiest way to do it is to simply give it to people in the form of tax rebates, Social Security payments, unemployment insurance. That works for a while, but you're limited because the more you give, you know, permanent income starts to kick in. If you give people $100, they might spend $100. If you give them $100,000, they're not going to spend that all in the same month. So that's the problem that you face even at that level. So again, that's a problem of implementation. It's not a problem of having an irrational policy. What are the long-run effects of some short-run policies? Again, I would argue rationality. When the Obama team came in, there really was nothing that they could do other than something dramatic. They had to do something dramatic, and I would say that was a rational policy for them. They had to differentiate their product from the previous administration. They were elected to do that, and so they did that. Unfortunately, what I think was a short-run rational policy looks like a long-run irrational policy, or wrong policy for the long run. Not irrational, that's not the right word. And this graph shows you that. So if you look at this, this shows the debt to GDP ratio for a variety of countries, the G7 countries primarily. And you see that all of them have experienced an increase, almost all with the exception of Germany, just a small increase, have experienced increases since the recession in the debt to GDP ratio. But the United States is certainly one of the biggest offenders in this respect. So our long-term debt to GDP ratio has been about 38% over the last 30 years. And it was pretty stable throughout that period. Went up at one point to about 45%, then came back down. But has not been way above that. By the end of this year, we'll be at about 72%. So the debt in the United States has doubled in a period of about 4 years. That's a big deal. And the question is, what did we buy? I showed you earlier that what we bought at best was 3 percentage points of growth. So the question that you have to ask is whether the long-run consequences of that, that cost is lower than the short-run benefits of that 3%. Let me conclude. All right, so we started out by talking about rationality, and I would argue that policymakers do attempt to be rational in their decision-making. What that implies is during crisis periods, you're going to see allowing more independent authority, almost by definition, because you need to act quickly. But finally, that rational policy, just because it's rational, doesn't mean it's always correct. Obviously, you know, information is imperfect, and what is sometimes short-run, individually rational is not always long-run policy that's wise as you look out over the distant future. So let me stop there, open it up. Happy to talk about anything, gossip, anything you want. Probably that, again, that's my comparative advantage at this venue. So open it up for any questions, discussion. Please. Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, again, I wouldn't rule. I didn't say there was no contagion. I believe that, you know, contagion is in there. This goes back to this old literature of whether these externalities are pecuniary or whether they're technological. The kind of recession that you're thinking about technological externalities, essentially unpriced stuff that has implications for other sectors, causes other sectors to fail. And there's no doubt that there was that. You know, I'm not worried about the pecuniary kind, which are transfers. Some of those are important, of course, but that's not the structure here. The reason I say I think it was mostly popcorn is that what I meant is that there were fundamental problems that were pervasive throughout the system. So there was a common shock. In this case, the common shock, I believe, was excessive leverage. So I don't have the slides with me to show you this. But if you look at the leverage that took place over the period between 2003 and 2007, that was a period during which credit spreads fell and fell dramatically. So people did the rational thing. You know, money was cheap, so you invest in more risky kinds of investments during that period. And this was pervasive. It wasn't just the housing market, although, of course, the housing market was the epicenter of it, but you saw it in everything. So you saw a lot of excessive excessive risk-taking, and when I say excessive, again, I'm thinking ex post excessive. That doesn't mean that ex ante it wasn't a rational thing to do, but as it turned out, ex post it wasn't the right thing to do. And that affected so many institutions across the entire economy that my view is that while contagion is a factor, it was a relatively small factor in this context. That even without that, even if we could have removed all of the contagion, you just had so much going on that by itself would cause about 11% dent in GDP, which is essentially what we saw. And you know, I don't think you need to appeal much to contagion in order to get a shock of that magnitude causing that kind of recession. But again, I wouldn't deny that contagion is a factor. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, go ahead, Elhanan. Yeah. 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 Yeah, I mean, we certainly thought about it that way as well. I think the overriding issue for us at the point in time was the loss of jobs. But we did think about, you know, when I was the guy going through the books, not, you know, I had my team doing it with me, but going through the books of GM and of Chrysler and saying, you know, could these guys be viable? GM in particular certainly looked like they could be viable. You didn't have to go back very far. In 2007, they were a profitable company. In fact, you know, it was funny because at that time people kept saying, you know, why don't these guys make cars that people want to buy? Well, you know, GM was the #1 automaker in the world until about 2007, 2008, and then they started, you know, kind of oscillating with Toyota, but they were always, you know, either #1 or #2. Someone was buying those cars. So we did think of them, I certainly thought of them as potentially viable in the long run. The problem that we saw, it's very nice, I'm always happy that people think of the bailout as being associated with Obama, the auto bailout as being associated with Obama rather than with Bush. I mean, it actually was us because, you know, we were the guys who had to decide whether to give them the loan or not. Had we not, Obama wouldn't have had a chance to make that decision. But fine, you know, give it to Obama. I'm more than happy to let him have that one. But it was, I would say I would agree with Larry just 100% on that's how we thought about it as well. And in fact, I remember having conversations literally in the Oval Office talking about, you know, was this a positive NPV company? You know, if you could just get over this credit hump, was it a positive NPV company? We thought yes with GM. Chrysler was a little less clear, and there was some, you know, some talk at one point about would you maybe separate them and save GM and not save Chrysler, and again, decision was made not to do that. But again, it would have been based on exactly that logic that Larry expressed. So I think that's right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I can tell you the facts. The facts is they could not, okay? And that I know because, well, I know. We went to all the usual suspects and said, you know, you guys willing to give them what's called DIP financing, debtor in possession financing. Warren Buffett, J.P. Morgan, which was the only bank really that was in a position to do that at that point in time. No one was willing to extend these guys credit. Remember that those markets were pretty locked up. So, this was a period during which loans were very tough to make. Remember that the LIBOR had reached 7%, which means, not only are people not going to make long-term loans to General Motors, they're afraid to lend to reputable banks even overnight because they're worried that their counterparties won't be there in the morning. So it was a pretty scary environment, and all I can tell you is that people were just, too afraid to take the chance at that point in time. But we were pretty confident that no matter how we did it, whether we put them into Chapter 11, whether we just gave them a loan, if we put them into Chapter 11, it was still going to be the case that the government was going to be the source of that debtor in possession financing. No one else was going to come in to do this. Yeah, Gene, please. Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. Actually, that's a great question. I can tell you give you some inside baseball. What happened was, this was a pretty interventionist Republican administration. I mean, if you think about what we did, we bailed out the auto industry. You got the TARP. You had government guaranteeing bank liabilities through the FDIC. You had the Fed coming in, acting in a very dramatic way. So there were people in Congress, particularly Republicans, who really did not like this, and so they were not singing the same song. And I remember, you say, what happens when this sort of thing happens? Well, this was another game of chicken. So two things happened. First of all, we tried to get our Republican allies in Congress to help us with this. There was a piece of legislation that they could have put through that would have allowed us to use already allocated money to the auto industry, which we didn't like anyway. It was this stuff, that we thought was sort of, anyway, we didn't like that money. And we thought, let's use that to bail these guys out. We tried to get the Republicans to do this. It is probably the nastiest, most personal, insulting meeting I have ever been to in my life. Not so much to me insulting, but my poor chief of staff. I mean, you had guys out there saying, I won't tell you who, but I remember one guy saying, how long have you been chief of staff? And he said, since, so-and-so. And he said, you should have been out of there 6 months ago. You're a disgrace. Okay? So as you can see, there was tension. I'm sorry? I guess it's... Yeah, maybe that's mild by Israeli standards, but we thought it was pretty tough. The other thing, by way of chicken, the other thing that happened was the Democrat Congress adjourned and left town. They just said, "We're getting out of here. You guys deal with it." So, and they said, "If you don't want to save them, tough." So that was another thing that happened. So again, and then the media, by the way, it's interesting that you mentioned the media. The toughest media on us by far was actually Fox, which is viewed as the kind of, conservative Republican part of the TV, and they were really tough on us, because they just hated the bailouts of all this stuff, all the intervention. So anyway, yes, sir. Yeah. Well, I would go back to popcorn and dominoes again, because I think that what the Europeans are doing right now, although they're starting to move, I think, in a better direction, but until the last month or so, most of the discussion was about the structure of the bailout and preventing contagion. You hear that constantly. If Greece falls, we're worried that Italy will go. Well, my view is that Italy's situation has very little to do with Greece, and there may be some contagion, but saving Greece will not save Italy if Italy's structural problems are so fundamental that they can't be resolved. I actually think they can be resolved. I mean, if I look at Italy, Italy is actually in pretty good shape in terms of its budget deficit. It's actually it runs a primary surplus, so its deficit only comes from servicing debt, and so at least conceptually, Italy doesn't have that big a problem. Greece, I think, is a completely different story. They're going to have to default. They are in the process of defaulting one way or the other in terms of restructuring their debt. But my view is that the focus really needs to be on long-term structural reform and doing it as quickly as possible rather than on preventing the contagion. Preventing the contagion is probably not the right way to go. I would rather see them do what we did in the second wave of the TARP, which is make sure that the financial institutions that are viewed as crucial to keeping the European economies going are strong enough to survive the shock, and don't try to buy up all the toxic assets. It's just impossible to do that. So again, I would use our experience and say, you know, do the part that we did right, not the part that we did wrong. Yeah. I'm sorry, say it again? Yeah. Oh, as a repeat player. Yeah. Yeah, that's true, and you know, if you think of it as a repeated game, you might get a different structure. The problem is, I think the government is not so much a repeated game, because the problem is that the government changes. So, you know, you can think of Congress maybe as having some longevity, but would you want to think of the Obama administration as being the same thing as the Bush administration? So, and particularly in the context that we were in, this was, remember, the last months of the Bush administration, and we knew we had a dramatic change coming in. You know, hope and change was coming in with Obama in January. So we knew there was going to be a significant change there. So, I mean, you know, obviously, I think a richer model, you're certainly right, we could bring in, you know, you should have a more dynamic context if you want to think about this. But to a first approximation, this static game of chicken, I think, did characterize what was going on there. Now, the dynamics came in that we did anticipate, we sat around and we said, you know, what's the Obama team going to do? Are there ways that we can tie their hands to make them look more like us? We tried to do that. It essentially, you know, didn't work. It was essentially a failure in terms of our ability to, and we knew, you know, we knew there wasn't much we could do, but in terms of our ability to get them to follow the path that we had laid down, you know, was very limited. So, yeah. Well, last one, and then we'd probably better break because it's lunchtime, I think. Yeah.
How much of the small and medium-sized businesses were allowed?
How many to small and, yeah.
Like, you know, it's better to be a very big
Yeah.
business in order to attract
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, no question. There was, some of the TARP money did go to small and medium-sized, not businesses per se, but financial institutions. Some of it did go to them. The bulk of it, the initial wave, went to 19 very large firms. And again, the reason for that is primarily one of implementation. So if you think about trying to get the money out quickly. And remember, the goal at that point was to capitalize the financial sector to make sure that it was strong enough to survive the shock. It's simply impossible to do that with lots of small and medium-sized financial institutions in a short period of time. They did come in after, so the first wave, I believe, was like late October, early November, and then over the next couple of months, Treasury did get some money to mid-sized banks as well, but it took a lot longer to do that. And so, again, it was primarily a decision of implementation rather than anything else. But it was also probably the most effective way to do it, because if you had the top falling, and you know, again, it's hard to remember this stuff. I remember it when I go back, but on that week that Lehman failed, we were worried at that point that, you know, Merrill had already failed too. Remember, Merrill failed the same weekend that Lehman did, and we were worried that Goldman was going to fail on Friday and that Morgan Stanley would fail as well. So, and those were enormous, you know, in terms of their implications for the financial sector also. So it just, you know, it was more a question of implementation.
Did you also wipe out the equity?
No. Now, okay, so good question. Why is it that we didn't wipe out the equity? Some of it, yes. Most of it, not in the financial sector. That was probably about number 17 on our list of things to worry about at that point. Now, when I look back at it and I say, you know, when you were doing a deal, the AIG is the specific one where you think about that. So when you bail out AIG, you're saving Goldman, you're saving Deutsche Bank, you're saving a lot of very large financial institutions that had as their counterparty AIG, and you'd say, why didn't you make these guys take a haircut, right? That would be the obvious thing to do. The answer is, again, there would be two answers to that. First of all, at that point, we were trying to get money into those financial institutions, not out of those financial institutions. So there's kind of a tension there between saying you want to save the taxpayer money, but at the same time you want to make sure that these guys have sufficient financial resources. But the main reason for it was essentially, again, implementation. It takes months to negotiate a deal with haircuts. Look at what's happening with Greece right now, trying to negotiate haircuts with their creditors. You know, they've been talking about this stuff since the summer. It's already, you know, turn of the year, and you know, you still haven't gotten the thing negotiated. We were in the midst of a crisis where we had runs on the banks. We literally had lines around the block from Wachovia and Washington Mutual. So, you know, getting these guys to take haircuts while ex post, I think everybody would agree would be something that one would have wanted at the time, was kind of a second order problem, and that's the reason. So I better stop. This is the kind of gossip we can do over lunch, and I don't want to run into the lunchtime, and so let me stop there. Thank you very much.